doesn't love a good old-fashioned bicep curl, right? Whether you're a physical therapist, a personal trainer, or strength and conditioning coach, you probably deal with bicep curls at one point or another during your day. Now, if we compare a bicep curl to a more technical lift like a squat or a deadlift, we can confidently say that the deadlift and the squats are harder to learn and harder to coach, and the bicep curls are easier to perform and easier to coach. However, that is the exact problem. Because the level of easiness and the level of lack of awareness that's really required during a bicep curl, we actually have a lot of compensations that happen. So whether your goal is to increase the size of your arms or you're rehabbing a bicep and trying to get it stronger, I want to make sure that you avoid these 3 common mistakes that we see with a bicep curl. Before we get into these 3 common mistakes, we first need to actually define what a mistake is. I have a very easy saying that works for any exercise, and that is that your execution needs to align with your intent. Now, what does that mean? Well, we can look at 2 different scenarios. If your intent is to truly rehab the bicep and perform the bicep curl in a very strict form and really kind of isolate the bicep curl, then swaying when you come up for the bicep curl and compensating through trunk momentum, that would not align with your intent of isolating and trying to get the bicep curl stronger. However, if you are trying to overload the bicep, that is your intent. And when you go to execute, you're actually using the trunk lean and controlling that negative. In that case, your execution does align with your intent. The intent is to overload the bicep. So we're trying to help or assist on the way up and then overload on the way down. So in that example, that would be right. So I think a lot of us jump to conclusions on how we define a right versus wrong exercise based off the execution. But if you're watching someone perform an exercise, if you don't know their intent, you can't truly say that that exercise is good or bad based off how they're performing it. So for our intention for this video's purpose, we are going to say that we are trying to do more of a isolated bicep curl and stick to more the traditional good form that the majority of people try to execute. So the first mistake is wrist extension. Now this one is really subtle but tends to cause a lot of problems. So if you're dealing with a patient or a client that's been performing a lot of bicep curls or any sort of elbow flexion and even into the shoulder flexion and start complaining of wrist pain and or elbow pain, check out their bicep curl. What you'll find is they probably have either a subtle or an excessive amount of wrist extension. Now, why does this happen? Well, it usually happens for one of 2 reasons. The first is the patient or the client may lack the awareness. They may not even know that they're doing it. And it's more common that as they're descending, they're extending their elbow and they continue their extension from a lack of awareness into the wrist. So something like that, it's as easy as increase their awareness that they are doing that and you will probably solve their problem. The next reason that it happens is as a mechanism to try to decrease stress and force through the elbow and the bicep, right? So we can start to load up the forearm as a means of stability to assist the bicep curl. Now, if you go back to our intent is to isolate and get the bicep stronger, so that would not be ideal. So again, something as easy as decreasing the weight to avoid that unnecessary stress, right? They might just be performing weight that's too much. And increase the awareness by simple cues to really make sure as they go through that descent, they're not allowing that wrist to go into extension. The second mistake is shoulder momentum. Again, this is one that if you don't have the awareness, you don't know you're doing it, but it's also an example that if your intent is to overload, then momentum through the shoulder would be okay. But again, our execution needs to align with our intent. So our intent is isolated bicep strength. We're going to try to avoid the excessive shoulder momentum. So why does this happen? This typically happens because the weight is too heavy and or the patient or client is fatigued. They are using alternate strategies to try to assist and get the motion of the elbow up and contract the bicep. The solution is pretty easy. We just need to simply cue them and make sure they are aware that they're first doing that, because we can't change something if your patient or client doesn't know that they're actually doing it, right? And then we probably need to decrease the load. They probably hit their fatigue point. You could add in a rest pause, right? If someone's doing a set of 12 and you start seeing a ton of shoulder momentum at rep 8, take 10 seconds. Give yourself a small percentage of recovery and then continue with the good form. So again, awareness and the load are really the key solutions to this common mistake. The third and final mistake is starting position. To make sure that you are setting your patient or client up for success with their bicep curl, we have to be in the right starting position. If we're in that faulty starting position, chances are we'll never keep up and we'll start feeling other things such as the shoulder, the elbow, or the wrist hurting, which isn't going to maximize our efforts with the bicep curl. Now, the two main starting positions that typically happen that we want to avoid is excessive shoulder extension. So they're starting way too far back. And again, if your intent is aligned with your execution and you're performing it in a lengthened position to try to get a very specific outcome, then that's fine. But again, what tends to happen when we're in this position is most people roll and dump into their anterior shoulder. So when we dump into that anterior shoulder, we're putting that, really the head of the humerus and our shoulder in a relatively vulnerable position. So we want to make sure we are increasing the awareness of our patient to start in that more kind of neutral position. Now, the other, and I would say more undetected starting position that happens is excessive external rotation. A lot of times people drive through their elbows and perform their bicep curl in this position. The problem is we're just winding up that shoulder, and chances are your shoulder is going to be more active than your bicep. And or you'll probably fatigue out quicker because of the shoulder being more active than the bicep. So again, increase the awareness and cue your patient that they should have their wrist and elbow in a relatively straight position with their arms slightly out, right? Abducted, not externally rotated. And when they're in this position, when they're going through their bicep curl, everything should stay in that nice straight line.